Demuth by Edward Bristol. Read by Chris Edland
and Edward Bristol, produced for Wildfish Audio in 2014.
The journey of a medieval woman and her dog. September 1499, Solingen, Germany. Lives End. Chapter 1. Outside, Hal, the Viking dog, growled a warning. Inside, Demuth snuggled closer to her stuffed horse and deeper into her feather bed. The dog growled again, now more urgent. A stranger approached their house. Probably a woman, thought Demuth. Hal used a more threatening tone for men. She moaned. It was far too early for regular customers. The wooden porch creaked under Hal's weight as he rose from his boar skin and jumped off into the garden. "Hello? Hello?" A young woman's voice, first weak, then fearful. "Help! The dog!" With a sigh, Demuth leaped from her bed. Hal would never hurt anybody, but his size and his eyes might easily scare someone to death. "One moment," she called as loud as her sleepy voice allowed. "I am coming." She swiped a few curls from her face and opened the door, shivering cool air creeping under her nightgown. Fog had filled the valley. In the first light of dawn, a woman stood on the path along the medicine garden, her posture twisted and bent. Her fists clutched over her belly. A few paces away stood Hal, white markings shining on black fur, barring the woman's way with stiff legs, raised shoulders, and folded ears. The dog turned, awaiting his mistress's order, one eye amber-colored and one ice blue. "Hal?" Demuth called softly. "Come here." Hal relaxed his posture and returned to the porch in a few bouncy strides. He wagged his tail, smiled what Demuth knew was a smile, a slight lifting of his upper lips, followed by his good morning tune, sounding like "awo, awo." The dog got a brief pat from Demuth, and then, his job done, he sat on the boar skin and refocused his attention on the little path that led up to their house. Demuth looked around, blue eyes wide to penetrate the fog. All was quiet in her little valley. The creek murmured. Birds greeted the coming day. Her master's castle rose dark over the mountain. This girl must have come alone. She hadn't moved but stood hunched over, just where Hal had left her, looking at Demuth with dark shadows under feverish eyes. Demuth thought her to be well under 20, though pain and fear had now distorted her broad face beyond youth. There was only one reason for a young girl to come alone at such an hour, and that reason was a dangerous one. The burning stake awaited those who got caught. Come inside, fear not." Demuth held out her hand. The sooner she got her visitor out of sight, the better. The girl made a few awkward steps and groaned, sweat purling on her forehead. Demuth hurried to help. Inside the house, she led the girl to an alcove and heaved her onto a long table. The girl hissed in pain as she stretched on the old stained wood. She made an effort to speak, but Demuth motioned her to stay quiet. The girl opened her hand, showing 3 silver groschen. Demuth took the coins and laid them aside. She lit a massive oil lamp fixed to the wall above the table. The strong flame, reflected downward from a polished silver shade, bathed the alcove, the family's operating theater for generations, in bright light. Demuth looked into the girl's eyes, felt her pulse, and then unbuttoned her skirt. The belly was hard and tense, pale yellowish and bloated. 4 or 5 months in the making, Demuth thought. The veins on the girl's hips stood out in a nasty blackish blue, and a putrid smell filled the alcove. The baby must have died weeks ago, but for a reason beyond Demuth's knowledge, it had not been expelled. Now it had to come out, or the girl would die. "I have to put you to sleep," said Demuth. The girl agreed, with a faint nod. Demuth stepped out of the alcove and took a lavender tin jar from the medicine shelf. She opened the jar, held it under her nose, closed her eyes, and inhaled the sharp yet earthy scent. She stood lost, absent-minded, then recollected herself and scooped 3 scrupulum from the dark brown paste, enough to put this innocent girl into oblivion. She turned to the operating table. "Open your mouth." The girl held out her quivering tongue, and Demuth emptied the pipette into the girl's mouth. Her eyes widened as she struggled with the bitter chunk of sticky substance. Demuth pulled the girl's head up and gave her a sip of water. Brown saliva dribbled from the girl's lips. After a while, the girl nodded and showed her empty mouth. "Well done," said Demuth. "Now rest. The worst is over." Demuth changed into her working robe, opened a hidden compartment in her desk, and brought out a heavy leather bundle. She opened the bundle and unfolded it onto the side table. The surgery set, knives, pliers, and scissors, had been made in Solingen for her great-grandfather and had passed into her possession and responsibility. Her fingers wandered over the immaculate steel with its precise edges, the metal's smooth glow defying nature. When Demuth turned, the girl's expression had softened, her features relaxed, revealing her youth, and even a hint of contentment. "Feeling better already, huh?" Demuth smiled and stroked the girl's feverish head. A tear fell as the girl left her pained body. Chapter 2. Hours later, with gray shadows under her eyes and trembling hands, Demuth rolled the pieces of a tiny body into a linen cloth and tied it up with string. She laid the little bundle at the girl's feet and threw her bloodied apron into a bucket. She opened the door and stepped into the fresh air of a late summer morning. Hal jumped from his boar skin, pressed against her, and sang his hello song, adding "wee-oh" at the end, indicating hunger. "Not yet, my friend." Demuth scratched his back, but then pointed to the boar skin. "Stay. Watch it some more." Hal flapped his ears, sighed, and went back to his sentry. Demuth returned into the house, laid fresh wood on the fire, soaked the surgery set in warm water, and then stood motionless. The sun had not yet risen over the mountains, but she already felt exhausted. Her breasts hurting, her back sore. Demuth checked on the girl. She would sleep for another hour or 2. Yes, she decided with a smile, there was time for a well-deserved rest. She hadn't eaten, but the scent of death that now clung to the house suppressed her usual appetite. Once more she took the tin jar from the shelf and sat in her grandfather's rocking chair. All was quiet. The fire was in good shape. Hal was guarding the house. She opened the jar and measured 1 scrupulum into the pipette. Leaning against her stuffed horse, the bitter aroma filling her senses, she sighed in contentment and drifted off into soothing calm. Chapter 3. When Demuth opened her eyes, the girl was picking at the cord of the small bundle. "No, no!" Demuth bolted from the chair. The girl screamed and shrank back to the wall, clutching the bundle to her breast. "No!" "No, do not look!" Demuth gently took the bundle from the girl's hands and laid it on the bench. "He was dead." The girl stared. "He?" "Yes, it was a boy." "A boy?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. Demuth sat on the bed and put one arm around the shivering girl. "It is over now." The girl nodded, touching her belly. "I thought I was going to die." "You were going to die. There was poisoning." The girl buried her face in her hands, sobbed, and stuttered. "I jumped from the barn first, but I only sprained my ankle. Then I tried cow bitter. My friend said cow bitter would do it. 3 weeks ago. I was so sick." Cow bitter, yuck, nasty stuff. You are lucky to have survived. Demuth patted her knee. The girl's eyes wandered to the little bundle on the bench. What are you going to do with him? I am not going to do anything, said Demuth. You will bury him somewhere secret, deep in the forest, on your way home. Me? The girl swallowed air. Can you not bury him here? No, I do not want any graves in my garden. Everybody knew witches used fetus blood for magic spells. Before the girl could protest, Demuth asked, Do you know who the father is? Of course, the girl said with an indignant glance at Demuth, and leaned away from her embrace. Demuth raised her eyebrows and stifled a grunt. Of course, she thought. They always said that, even if they were not so sure. At times she resented these silly girls. Could they not be more careful? But this was a pointless discussion, of which Demuth had grown tired. Does the father know that you are here? Demuth asked. The girl shook her head and stared at her dirty feet. Does he know of the child? He only knows I was sick, often lately, but I did not tell him why. Does anybody else know? No, I was so afraid. Does anybody know you came to me? No. How about that friend with the cow bitter? No. The girl squirmed under the inquisition. Where does your family think you are? I told them I was going to visit our aunt and stay overnight. Does your aunt know? No, Auntie is old. She can't remember her own name. No one knows. I told you. The girl was again on the verge of tears. Good. Keep it that way, Demuth said, and laid her hand on the girl's knee. This is not a matter for gossip, you know. The girl nodded. She straightened her body carefully and tried to stand up, but swayed. Let me warm a soup for you. You need strength, Demuth said. No, I cannot eat. You cannot walk either, not on an empty stomach anyway. You must stay until you have eaten. I have rabbit stew. Sometimes Demuth snared a rabbit. It was forbidden. All game was the Duke's, but he was rarely at his castle, and the master was her friend. He would protect her even if she was caught poaching. Demuth set a blackened pot over the fire, drew a cup of beer from a barrel in the corner, helped the girl to the table, and covered her with a blanket. Soon the rich scent of stew filled the room. Hall pushed his head through the door and signaled his interest in sharing the meal. "Wee-oh!" "He speaks!" said the girl with childish delight. Demuth nodded. "He sings." She raised her hand and said to Hall, "Out, wait." Hall pulled back with a grump. "When did you last eat?" asked Demuth. "I cannot remember. Ever since I took the cow bitter, I have been ill." "Ah, then this soup will work miracles. Everybody feels sick on an empty stomach." Demuth soaked pieces of dry bread in the stew and threw them into a big bowl. "First, the animals," she said, and carried Hall's meal out to the porch. The dog gave a quick "awo" and stuck his head into the bowl. Next, Demuth filled a plate for the girl, and only then did she fill one for herself. They ate in silence. "This is very good," said the girl after a while. "Thank you. I feel much better already." She was eager to leave, but Demuth ordered her to rest. They exchanged mundane chatter while Demuth worked in the house. When the sun broke over the hills, the girl was determined to start her homeward journey. "I will give you a little help for the walk." Demuth took the tin jar from the shelf. "It will relieve the pain and give you strength." She squeezed an eighth of a scrupulum onto a piece of bread. Demuth handed her the little bundle. The girl took it, albeit reluctantly. Demuth put one hand on her shoulder and gave her a hard look. "Bury him in the forest. Do not mark the grave." The girl tried to pull away, but Demuth held her back. "Do not speak to anybody about this, ever." Another nod. "Promise." "I promise," whispered the girl, and clutching the bundle to her chest, she escaped through the door. Hall jumped up and patrolled her to the edge of the forest. Demuth stood on her porch, biting her lip as the girl disappeared between the trees. The soothing calm of the morning's papaver had already abandoned her. Always too soon lately. Despite the mild sunshine, she felt cold and empty. Hal returned and broke her gloomy mood by pushing his wet nose under her skirt, touching the back of her knee. Demuth squeaked and giggled and turned to begin her day's work. She scrubbed the alcove with vinegar and hot water, polished the surgery set until it shone, and returned it to the hidden compartment. She cleaned the hearth, brought in fresh firewood, and washed the pottery in the creek. Though she could well afford help, she preferred to run her little household alone, without the complications that a servant would inevitably bring into her life. Ever since her brother's death, she had insisted on living alone, an unusual arrangement for an unmarried woman, raising many eyebrows in the village. While she was preparing the master's ointment, the baker came to fetch his cough draught, and wasted a precious hour with gossip and flattery, until Demuth remarked that the master was waiting for his daily massage. The man took the hint and finally left. Demuth stepped into her brother's leather jacket, the work of a gifted artisan in Wuppertal. Double-stitched deerskin on the outside, soft lamb hide on the inside, by far Demuth's most valued possession. She never left the house without the jacket. The heavy scent reminded her of Meph, and filled her with warmth and love. After her brother's death 5 years ago, she had adjusted the jacket to her slender frame, and had ordered a set of brass buttons to replace the traditional hooks that used to close the front. The buttons, a fashionable invention from the South, held tight and never came loose. Though comfortable as a bed and protective as armor, the jacket was strange attire for an unmarried woman. In fact, it was absolutely inappropriate. Any respectable mother would forbid her daughter to go out in such a manly garment. But Demuth, orphaned since birth, knew no such restrictions. The villagers thought her eccentric, not outright crazy, perhaps, but not normal either. However, she cared not. Her apothecary stood under the master's personal protection, and thus far the slanderers and the pious had tolerated her singularities because they needed her. What the villagers did not know of, and would never have tolerated, was the stiletto hidden inside her jacket's left sleeve. Its hilt lay under the seam at her wrist, the tip reaching up to her elbow. Demuth pulled the blade from its sheath and checked its double-sided edges. Wrought from the very best Solingen steel, she kept it as sharp as her surgery tools, and always within reach, though women were banned from carrying weapons. Only last year, the basket weaver's daughter had disappeared. After weeks, they had found her naked body deep in the eastern forest. Demuth regularly ventured into the wilderness alone, gathering herbs, mushrooms, or poisonous frogs. Hal, always by her side and fearsomely protective of his mistress, could be killed by a single shot from a crossbow. Demuth did not want to stand unarmed against those who thought themselves above God's law. She sheathed the blade, shouldered the medicine pouch, and opened the door. Hal took one look at his mistress's outfit, the leather jacket and the medicine pouch, and began to howl his "We Go" song, pirouetting from the porch. Demuth chimed in and clapped her hands, encouraging Hal to ever wilder tunes as he danced through the garden. They followed a narrow track to a wooden bridge across the creek. As always, Hal skipped the bridge and dashed into the shallow water, chasing stone trout, until Demuth called him to follow her onto a steep trail that ascended toward the castle. Demuth had scaled this trail every single day of her life, often twice. She did not change the speed or rhythm of her brisk step, her blood quickening, her lungs burning with delicious energy. The trail was perhaps older than the castle itself. For centuries, probably since Adam and Eve, autumn after autumn, the forest had stacked up rotting foliage all around. But the path had been cleared and compressed by hundreds of shuffling feet, hooves, and carts. Now, the path lay yards below the surrounding forest, a deep trench, hard and tight, in which, standing upright, one was on eye level with tree roots. Demuth overtook the afternoon shadow creeping up the hill and stepped into the sun. The warm rays on her back, Demuth smiled, closed her eyes, and kept walking until dizziness made her sway. Rapid footsteps trampled down the hill. Demuth opened her eyes. It was the cook's eldest son, running at full speed. When he noticed Demuth, he gave a scream, stumbled, and crashed in what looked like a painful somersault. "Ho, not so fast," said Demuth. Though she did not particularly like the boy, she liked broken bones even less. "Are you hurt?" Demuth asked, holding back Hal, who had jumped to her side. The boy did not answer, but scrambled backward with a hateful expression. He waved his hands, as if to warn her not to come closer. The boy had inherited his father's huge hands, the hands his wife used to call half-pigs while she was still alive, to suffer their punishing blows. Demuth's good mood vanished. "Hey, no reason to grumble at me, young man," she said, raising one finger. Instead of making an excuse, the cook's son jumped up, and to Demuth's astonishment, climbed out of the trench to run past her on top of the embankment. At a safe distance, the boy jumped back onto the path and continued his reckless descent. Demuth looked after him, sad and bewildered. That boy and his father still blamed her for their mother's death, but the woman had been sick for years, suffering from the chronic influenza so common in this shadowy valley. A harsh winter had driven the last strength from her weak body. Unfortunately, the poor woman died with a bottle of Demuth's popular flu draught in her hands. It had been a harmless infusion of herbs in honey, but the cook had called her a murderess and a sorceress until the master forced him to withdraw his accusations. Thoughtfully, Demuth continued over the cobbled road that led through the upper settlement, timber-framed houses inhabited by the master's servants and guards, many empty and in disrepair, and finally toward the castle, a mass of gray stone dominating the mountain. Hal overtook his mistress to lead the way, daring any local mutt to bark at them. They passed the church with the little graveyard and the priest's personal dwelling, crossed over the drawbridge and into the courtyard. Hal chased a blackbird and then began his routine marking of the trees around the castle. Demuth took the final steps in 3 strides and turned for the view. Up here, the sun shone warm and bright. Thick forests stretched over soft mountains in every direction. Smoke rose from farms and workshops, but the land beyond appeared uninhabited. Few knew or cared what lay beyond the horizon. Down in her valley, everything was in plain sight, but up here the world's immensity took her breath away again and again. Some day, she promised herself, she would travel to Cologne, the proud city to the south, the biggest in the Holy Roman Empire. Though only 2 days' march, Demuth had never seen its wonders. Her brother had always warned of the city. Too dangerous, too many evil people, he had said, and refused to take her on his annual trips to their uncle's apothecary in Cologne. She tore herself from the view and leaned against the heavy wooden doors. The dark antechamber was pleasantly cool after the steep ascent in the sun. The castle held its temperature all year around. Whether rabbits hopped over parched grass or frozen snow, the castle's thick walls maintained a cold but steady balance. The master's valet, a man with a visage of ever-distinguished stiffness, nodded a welcome and turned to announce her arrival to the master. As always, Demuth studied the hunting trophies in the antechamber. The gorgeous 12-pointed stag, a wolf, a giant badger, and most fascinating, a brown bear from a place called the Alps, standing in full height next to the corridor leading to the master's rooms. Demuth looked into the bear's face. Its black stone eyes stared over her head, impenetrable and mournful. As with everything else in the castle, the bear needed repair. Somebody had stolen its claws, probably to use as charms against wild animals. Though somehow related to the Duke, the master did not use a title. Everybody just called him the master. He was old, over 80 years, maybe even over 90, and had many ailments to cure. Demuth gave him a knee massage and administered a blueberry essence every day of the week. When Demuth entered his private chamber, the master lay half-reclined on a red couch, his trousers rolled up. He looked asleep, but Demuth knew the small eyes were most alive. Demuth squatted in front of the couch, opened the medicine bag, and got out a strong essence of yarrow and peppermint. "How is the master's knee today?" she asked. The old man grunted, opened his eyes, and said, "Of no use it is, just like me." "It will get better soon," Demuth said, and started to rub the fragrant ointment into the master's bony knee. "Has Hal barked?" asked the master. "No barking, only singing." "Funny fellow," the master chuckled. "He is perfect," Demuth said. This was their daily conversation. The old man leaned back to savor the massage. "What news from the world, master?" After a deep sigh, he said, "The Duke is coming, next month, with family and the Cardinal. A big fuss it will be." "How long will they stay?" "We do not know. He never tells." "Will there be a hunt?" "Sure, hunting, yes, and dancing and drinking, and no end to it. I'm getting too old for this." Demuth had seen the Duke only a few times in her life. The villagers were afraid of him. He was ill-tempered with the little people, but that could be expected. The men knew kings and even the emperor himself. "Is it true that the lady has a newborn girl?" "Yes, but they will stay in Düsseldorf. This is no place for babies," the old man said, and shook his head. "But the whole family used to reside here?" "Yes, this was the most important castle between Cologne and Düsseldorf." Demuth had heard the castle's story many times, but the old man never got tired of recounting its glorious history. "Every weekend we had a market, big fairs every month. There were brawls in the beer house. We always had a drunkard locked up in the tower. We even had a village prostitute or two." He looked at Demuth and laughed. "But you know all this." "I always enjoy the details, master," said Demuth, smiling. "Tell me more." "You are kind to pay attention to the babbling of an old man," he sighed. "I was young then, and the Duke—" An urgent knock came from the door. "What is it?" The door opened, and the valet stuck his head through the opening. "Sir, the priest is here, with, several people." The master frowned. "People? What kind of people?" "Sir, a dozen villagers and 2 monks." The master growled. "Have I no time for myself?" Embarrassment encroached on the valet's stiff demeanor. "Sir, forgive me, but the priest is very upset." "Is he now?" The valet nodded. "Well then, let him in. But only the priest, mind you, nobody else. I'm having my old knees treated here, for Christ's sake. This better be important." A few moments later, the priest's impatience filled the room. Demuth shifted her position to glance at the man. His bow legs quivered, his bald head shone red, and his belly, attesting to much drink but little work, heaved. The priest must have been running, surely a rare occurrence. To Demuth's surprise, he was not looking at the master. Instead, he was gawking straight at her with a spiteful expression. Demuth withdrew her eyes at once. The priest regularly assailed her for lack of enthusiasm at Sunday church, but Demuth did what was necessary, and more the church could not command. The master frowned at the silence. "So, Father, why can I not enjoy the one remedy that eases my suffering?" The priest cleared his throat and said, "A girl has been found in the forest. She was digging a grave." Demuth squeezed the master's knee too hard. "Ouch, Demuth, ouch!" the old man exclaimed. Irritated, he looked at the priest. "A grave for whom?" "A fetus, her baby," said the priest. Black dots flickered in front of Demuth's eyes. A wave of nausea surged. The air felt too thick to breathe. She concentrated hard not to vomit on the good rug. "The baby had been dissected, its blood drawn, a witch's work," added the priest. "Father, do not be hasty," the master said, and got up. Demuth shuffled sideways, but remained on her knees, staring at the empty couch. "Where is the girl?" asked the master. "We threw her in the tower. The monks are questioning her as we speak." "Oh, be kind with the poor creature. Surely she has suffered enough," said the master, his voice now more pleading than commanding. "Satan had his way. We must not waver in our resolve to fight evil." The master slapped his forehead but said nothing. Instead, he began to pace the room, muttering to himself. Then he stopped, with a decision, and said aloud, "Let us go to the tower. I need to hear her story myself." The master made for the door, but the priest did not move. The old man turned back in surprise. "Come, no time to lose," he said. "First, I need to speak to you in private," said the priest. Demuth looked up, and for an instant met the old man's eyes. His shoulders slumped. He was a clever man. "Come back tomorrow, Demuth," he said slowly. Demuth nodded and collected her medicine. She got up, bowed to the master, and staggered past the priest with another bow, but kept her eyes cast downward. The men remained silent until the door snapped closed. Excited voices poured from the antechamber. Demuth swayed as she walked down the corridor, wishing she had brought Hal inside with her. But the dog preferred to patrol the area while she treated the master. The valet was blocking the entrance to the corridor. When Demuth approached, he stepped aside. She searched his eyes, but he did not react, his face impenetrable like that of the bear under which he now stood. When Demuth entered the antechamber, all heads turned, and an icy silence fell. She smelled the ill will and bloodlust steaming from the gathered mob. The cook stood with his eldest son, still panting. The old nurse was there, the baker's daughter, and grieving Ellie, a commonly disliked widow, along with 2 grim monks and several other unpleasant characters from the upper and lower settlement. Aside from the group stood an elderly woman that Demuth had never seen before, but whose broad face she recognized at once. It was the mother of the young girl now under inquisition in the tower. The woman prayed with closed eyes, her face glittering with tears. Demuth felt detached from her body, as if in a dream, or rather a nightmare. She could not greet these people as custom demanded. She would not greet these fools, would not meet their malignant eyes. Her head low, she pushed for the main door. Raised voices echoed from the master's chamber, the priest shouting, the master interjecting, "No!" and "No!" Demuth walked on, afraid to stumble over her own feet, a voice in her head crying, "Out! Out!" 3 more steps, and she reached for the door. As she put her hand on the brass handle, the cook, speedier than his weight might suggest, stepped up to block the door with 1 foot. In vain, Demuth yanked at the door. It shivered between frame and foot, but did not move. The cook stood a span shorter than Demuth. She met the little red eyes with more courage than was in her heart. Men always hated to look up at her. His intolerable breath, beer and raw onions, made her blink, but she did not want to retreat from the door. "This time you will burn," the cook snarled, and then withdrew his foot, making a gesture for her to pass. Demuth pulled at the door. It suddenly felt impossibly heavy, not made of wood, but of stone, like a grindstone on hinges. She clutched the knob with both hands. Finally, the door moved. Just as Demuth shifted her weight to swing it open, the cook struck her in the face. It was a heavy blow from his half-pig hand. White sparks zipped before Demuth's eyes. Pain stabbed from her face into her neck. She staggered backward. The knob slipped from her hands, and the door slammed shut with a heavy thud. Time stopped. Demuth swayed, confused by her dreamy detachment. This was not happening. She watched the scene from above, as if she were one of the hunting trophies on the wall. The mob gasped, moaned. Somebody yelled in excitement. One of the monks clutched at the cook as he swung his fist for another blow. The valet jumped across the room, his face now distorted. In a series of lightning-fast images, she envisioned herself drawing the stiletto and stabbing the cook beneath his filthy double chin. Then, with sudden intensity, her mind returned into her body. Rage surged like a demon. Fortunately, before she could act, the monks and the valet pulled the roaring cook backward. Somebody opened the door and pushed her out. "Witch! You will burn! Burn!" shrieked the cook as she fled down the stairs, tears pouring from her eyes. Suppressing the urge to run, Demuth hurried through the yard and toward the drawbridge. Her lips quivered. She tried clicking her tongue for Hall, but found she could not. Chapter 4.
Hall is in high spirits as he patrols his undisputed territory in the upper settlement. He swaggers left and right, tail bouncing, tongue lolling over white teeth, his eyes shining, ready for a challenge or a chase. He startles at unusual noises from the castle, a shudder of wood yells and shouts. He must check on his mistress. It is too early, but she does not like to wait. He turns and makes straight for the inner courtyard. On the drawbridge, he sees his mistress hastening by, alone. She waves him to follow. Though Hal cannot see well at a distance, he knows something is wrong. She looks strange, angry and frightened at the same time. As if caught by a sudden headwind, his body narrows, his ears fall flat, and he quickens his pace to a gallop. Is he late? She is leaving, without him. Her body tense, leaning forward, her step is quick but shaky. Within seconds, Hal is behind her, but she hurries on without stopping. The bitter scent of pain, fear, and anger trails her. Hal turns and checks the vicinity for danger, but he cannot locate what is frightening her. She smells of many people, not only the old man, but strangers as well. Hal overtakes her to the left. As he glances up into her beloved face, he sees the most distressing sign of all. Water is flowing from her eyes. Her cheeks are wet. Hal whines in shock. She acknowledges him with a quick look but does not speak. There is red swelling around her eye. Her breath comes in raspy sounds, as if she has trouble breathing. Hal knows she cannot speak when water flows from her eyes. It is the one thing Hal fears most. When he met his mistress, her eyes were always wet. Those were terrible days. The memory of great suffering lingers in his soul. He had been separated from his family, left behind in the old man's castle. Alone he had howled for an eternity until the old man had carried him to the river and laid him in his mistress's lap. He never forgot how water had dripped from her eyes and onto his body. For days they sat in the corner of her house. Hal, longing for his mother, had smattered out his puppy grief in long avows and aways. His singing had made her smile, and he had loved her smile. The more she smiled, the more he sang, louder, wilder, always staying by her side in that sad corner. Though starving, he sang until the day she stopped crying, and they ate. Ever since they have been together day and night, and he will stay by her side. Nobody shall harm her as long as he is alive. Hal takes the lead position, walking a few steps in front and to her left as he has learned to do in the times of danger.
Chapter 5. Demuth did not look left or right as she hastened through the upper settlement, expecting hateful faces and pointing fingers in every door. The master would not appreciate what happened in his very antechamber, and yet was he able to stem the mob, once risen? Could the master stop the priest, the monks? No, she feared not. In the forest, she pulled a carved tusk vial from the band around her neck. With a tiny silver spoon worked into the lid, she scooped some papaver from the vial. When Demuth reached her own garden, somebody called her name. She startled, but it was only Jorg, the owner of a small schleifcotton up the little creek. Sitting on her porch, coming straight from work, as he often did, pretending to buy medicine, but often staying until morning. Jorg, a bearish man, taller than Demuth, always smelled of burned iron, soot, and coal. Yet he had the tender eyes of a woman. He stared at her face, jumped up from the porch, and rushed toward her. "What happened?" he asked, paling. Demuth kept her head low, trying to hide her bruises. With shaky fingers, she unlocked the door. "Hal, a word." Jorg patted him briefly and followed Demuth inside. As soon as the door shielded them from prying eyes, Demuth fell into Jorg's arms, sobbing unrestrained. "Who did this?" he asked. Anger flashed in his eyes. Demuth stepped out of his embrace and to the window. "I have to leave." "Leave? Why? Where to?" Demuth recounted the day in few words. "When I came from the master's chamber," she swallowed and fought new tears. "The cook punched me." "I will break his arms and throw him in the river," Jorg cried and lunged for the door, but Demuth barred his way. "I will teach that asshole to hit women," he snarled. "No, you will only cause more trouble." Jorg stomped around the room, fists clenched, knuckles white, jaw working. I will beat that fool until he regrets his deed, and then I will beat him some more." "Yes, that is a great idea." Demuth managed to smile. "But you will need a good reason. You have no right to fight over me." She wrapped her arms around him. "I wish I had the right," Jorg said in a soft, hoarse voice. Demuth nodded patiently. Jorg regularly prodded her about marriage, but Demuth did not want to give up her freedom, nor the cherished privacy of her own house. She liked things just as they were, or as they had been. "Yes," she said with a sigh that she could not suppress. "But now is not the time to discuss this. I will go to Cologne and hide at my uncle's. You can send me word through him." Jorg wrung his sooty hands. "To Cologne all by yourself?" "Yes, I always wanted to go. The master will calm them, and later I can come back." "Let me go with you," he said. "No, you cannot desert your cotton. You will be ruined." Jorg sat, sulking. "Go home. Guard your anger." "Can I not stay tonight?" he asked. No, I will leave before dawn." "But Cologne is far, and you are—" He trailed off without a suitable word. "Hal will eat anybody who gets too close," Demuth laughed, but Jorg did not. He got up and shook his head. "I am afraid," he said, "I will not see you again." "Pop, I will be back in a few weeks, a month. Send word to my uncle." She hugged him again. After a kiss and an unconvincing smile, she opened the door and they stepped out. Hal thumped the porch with his tail and gave a questioning "Oa?" Demuth squatted and rubbed Hal's neck. Jorg waved twice and then disappeared into the forest. "Tomorrow, you and me, we go to Cologne," Demuth whispered. Hal smiled, tail thumping. "But you will be scared of the city," Demuth said with a raised finger. Hal cocked his head. "Watch the house." Hal thumped his tail one more time, and then turned his eyes on the path with determined vigilance. Demuth hung her jacket on a hook, carefully washed her face, and fished a small-looking glass from the cabinet. In her sharply outlined features, the red swelling looked even worse than it felt. To her relief, the skin had not burst. It would heal without leaving a scar. She treated the bruises with honey. Her pale, smooth skin was the one vanity she allowed herself. Frequent baths and essences of walnut with butter were refined luxuries she could afford because she was the best and only apothecary under the castle. She sat with beer and a cold rabbit leg, again and again replaying the day's events. She had often feared something like this would happen, but it had come so suddenly and so violently. The mob was a frightful monster. Things might look different tomorrow. Perhaps the master was just now firing the cook and paying off the priest. Was running away not an admission of guilt? Yet she had done no wrong. She had saved the girl. But they would not even listen. After the meal, she pulled off her shoes and took the tin jar from the shelf. With a deep sigh, she sat on the bed next to the stuffed horse. All she wanted now was to forget this whole madness, kill the throbbing headache, and sleep. She scooped 2 scrupulum of papaver and had just set the pipette to her lips when Hall issued a warning. Somebody was outside. Her heart pounded irregularly as she controlled the urge to suck on the pipette. The porch creaked as Hall jumped into the garden. She held her breath. "Demuth!" A man's voice. She laid the pipette aside and got up with a curse. So soon? She pulled the stiletto from the jacket and hid it behind her back. "Demuth, your dog! Demuth!" There was no challenge or anger in the voice. "Coming!" Demuth rushed out the door. Through waves of fear, she strained to penetrate the falling darkness. It was the master's valet, alone, rooted motionless. Hall circled with stiff legs, bristling. Demuth clicked her tongue, and Hall stepped aside. Cautiously, the valet walked through the garden. Demuth remembered the bruises on her face and blushed. The valet had seen her shame, he knew. Hall overtook the man in a few leaps and positioned himself next to his mistress. Demuth laid one hand on Hall's neck, the other holding the stiletto behind her back. The valet glanced at Hall, now at his eye level, and stopped at a respectful distance. "The master sends pay for this month." He held out a purse of fine silver mail. Demuth stared at the purse, then at the man. The valet never came to pay her. The master did that personally. The valet looked straight at her, unblinking, intense in his formal demeanor. She wanted to protest, but then stepped forward and took the purse. It was heavy and closed with the master's seal. "I thank you." She stood hesitating. Could she trust this man, inquire what was happening in the castle? Before she made up her mind, the valet said, "The master sends you his everlasting respect." Demuth swallowed hard. This was not a casual greeting, but deliberately chosen words, a message. The man was a professional. He would say precisely what he was told to say, nothing more and nothing less. The valet nodded, as if to confirm Demuth's thoughts, and added, "The master expects you tomorrow at the usual time. Bring back his purse then." Demuth thought she saw a flicker of emotion, pity, worry, in his face. "Of course, tomorrow," she said as firmly as possible. "Goodbye, then." The valet gave her a final nod, and with an eye on Hall, turned to leave. Demuth rushed inside, broke the master's seal, and opened the purse. It contained a dozen coins. She fished one out and stood transfixed. The coin was as heavy as 2 or 3 of her precious gold gulden, but it was not worn out by countless transactions between merchants. The gold shone bright with lustrous engravings, a saint holding a staff on one side and a blossoming flower on the other. They must be from the master's private treasure, she thought, and stood in awe until the gift's true meaning slapped her in the face like a wet broom. She groaned and sat, holding her head. "Sends his everlasting respect, come back tomorrow," the valet had said. But no, the master did not want her to come back tomorrow. He had made a parting gift. Without a single discriminating word, he had relayed his message. "I cannot help. Run, now!" Moreover, Demuth realized with shock the master himself was afraid. He did not want to stand accused of helping a witch escape justice. He could claim that he had sent her due pay, and she had run off with his valuable silver purse. The valet was his witness. The master, too, was afraid of the mob. Demuth's face grew hard. She sucked a tiny portion of papaver from the pipette and cursed as she emptied the rest into the tin jar. For the next hour, she worked, concentrated, fast and precise. Into her heavy rucksack, she folded her winter shirt, her fox hat, and her fur tunic. On top, she placed the surgery set, a bundle of documents, and her De Simplici Medicina. Then she filled the travel basket with her most precious merchandise. If the mob rose to find her gone, she might lose the house to flames, but not the oils from faraway countries and the rare essences she had collected over the years. From the hidden compartment in the desk, she pulled a wooden box and emptied a dozen gold gulden, her life's savings, into the master's purse, and hung it around her neck. Her small coins clanked softly against the bigger ones. She stuffed bread, sausages, and biscuits into her day pouch, and poured white wine into a leather skin. The tin jar, a fishing line, the hand mirror, and a kitchen knife went into the side pocket. She looked around the room, hesitated, and finally lit the tall beeswax candle. Undisturbed, it would burn for days. "You are too big for traveling," she said to the stuffed horse. "I will be back soon." She snatched up the horse, hugging it like a toddler, swaying. Nausea and fear overwhelmed her senses. What was she doing? This was just a terrible misunderstanding. She could explain. Nobody would dare to burn down her house. But then she touched her bruised face and the master's heavy purse around her neck, and shook her head with a moan. No, it was all real. She straightened, laid the horse on her bed, put on her brother's jacket, and checked the stiletto. Everything was ready. Chapter 6.
Hal sits on his hind legs, erect and tense, listening. She packs, though night is falling. He likes the big rucksack. It means a good march, usually an overnight stay at a patient's house. Always a good adventure, but he is worried. Something has changed in her. In a short while she has grown older, and now she is in despair. Water runs from her eyes. Her friend, the one who always thinks of burnt metal, had been sent away. Hal had felt his sadness. This all seems very wrong. Softly, Hal arose to himself.
Chapter 7. Demuth shouldered the pack and took Hal's travel leash, a 6-foot hemp rope bound in leather, from a hook. Hal heard the sound of his leash and began a wild version of his "We Go" song. Quickly, Demuth opened the door and shushed him. Hal's head sank. He whined, his body losing all energy. Demuth immediately felt sorry. "We go together, of course," she whispered. "But we need to be quiet." She put a finger to her lips, the sign for stealth on a hunt. Hal's face lit up again. Demuth patted his head and drew a deep breath. Autumn lay in the air. It was the season to repair roofs, store firewood, make compost, and cure meat. Time to prepare for 6 months of blistering cold, not the time for traveling. She left the door unlocked and started on the little footpath along the river. Glancing at her beloved home, filled with warm candlelight, Demuth fought back tears. She clenched her fists and hurried on. Hal, with great night vision and familiarity on the tracks, led the way. Demuth followed the white tip of his tail like a torch in the dark. Nobody crossed their path. At night, people avoided leaving their houses. Dogs barked, but when they sensed Hal, they fell quiet. Soon they came to the river Whipper. The little creek behind Demuth's house bubbled of trout and stickleback, but the deep Whipper murmured of carp and perch. Ducks bred under its washed-out banks, and otters splashed in the current. The sounds of these rivers had been the background for her entire life. Demuth walked along the Whipper until after midnight, and then lugged her pack behind an elm tree and sat against its trunk. Hal snuggled up as soon as he smelled the sausage from the pouch. Soon after, Demuth spooned a generous scrupulum of papaver from the tusk vial and fell asleep, wedged between dog and tree.